dear listener. Check. Ooh. Oh, this minute. I don't know.
Just wait, bro. I'm in emergency right now.
Hmm. Mhm. So bad, yaar. Actually, like this goes, sir. उल्टे हो गए. Hmm. Meron isuot eh. Sandal dia. What? Salah aku mana nanti keluar sorry. What? What? Oh my favorite drink. Oh, oh. Cholera spoken native. Oh, oh. Actually, you go here. Oh, cat.
When facing d4, if black wants to imbalance the game and provoke dynamic fighting chances, then the tactically sharp but positionally risky modern Benoni may make an appearance on the board. Let's see how we reach this opening from the start. After the opening moves d4 and knight f6, white can grab more space with the popular c4. We now see the signature Benoni move, c5. Black immediately confronts white's center by adding pressure against d4. White can support d4 with knight f3 or the less ambitious e3, but the most challenging test is to accept the invitation to grab more central space with d5. Black has a variety of options, including playing g6 or even offering a pawn sacrifice with b5, known as the Benko Gambit. We're going to focus on the most direct move order, turning the game into the modern Benoni with e6, immediately confronting white's advanced pawn on d5. The d6 square does look a bit soft after this move, but white should not be tempted to grab more space with d6, as this would overextend the d-pawn when moves such as knight e4 or even queen b6 will make white regret this hasty decision. If white decides to play d takes e6, this simply encourages f takes e6, when black will be ready to strike in the center with d5. This suggests that white's best policy is to maintain the light-squared grip in the center and continue to develop with knight c3. Supporting the important d5 pawn and preparing possible expansion in the center with e4. Black now makes an important pawn exchange that defines several ideas for both sides in the modern Benoni. E takes d5, provoking c takes d5. After exchanging pawns on d5, black blockades the central d-pawn with d6. We have now reached a fundamental structure in the modern Benoni which will help us understand some of the key ideas for both sides. By playing e takes d5, black has opened up the e-file, preparing counterplay by placing a rook on e8 after black castles, and even in some cases black may play queen e7. Creating pressure down the e-file is especially important if white plays the sensible e4, grabbing space and reinforcing the d5 pawn, as this pawn will become an important target for black. This pawn exchange also removed white's pawn from c4, creating a 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the queen side for black. Without a pawn on c4, this loosens white's grip on the b5 square, so black will often prepare a6 and b5, mobilizing the pawn majority. This can be especially dangerous as more pieces are exchanged, as black's pawn majority may create a dangerous passed pawn later in the game. On the other hand, granting white a central space advantage is not without its drawbacks. The pawn on d5 does an excellent job depriving black's queenside knight of its most natural square, c6, and black's light-squared bishop is unable to access the e6 square. This pawn can be reinforced with e4, and black always has to be careful, as white has the dangerous idea of f4 and e5. In order to create active counterplay, black's dark-squared bishop belongs on the long diagonal with g6 and bishop g7, but the price to pay is removing a key defender of the backward d6 pawn, a strategic weakness white will often target. One other idea to keep in mind from white's perspective is that now that there isn't a pawn on c4, this is an excellent post for a knight, which will add serious pressure against the d6 pawn. Let's see a clash of these ideas in action, starting with e4. Taking more space in the center while reinforcing the d5 pawn, black prepares to activate the dark-squared bishop with g6. White has a variety of options, but let's take a look at the straightforward developing move knight f3. Black's dark-squared bishop comes to life on the long diagonal with bishop g7. Black's dark-squared bishop enjoys pressure down the long dark-squared diagonal, a consequence of provoking white's pawn to d5. There are no shortage of ideas for white, including h3, preventing bishop g4, or possible knight g4 to e5 ideas, when white will then support the e4 pawn with bishop d3. The strange-looking knight d2 can be played immediately, an idea we'll come to appreciate as we learn more about this dynamic opening. These are lines the interested viewer is encouraged to explore, but let's begin our journey with white's classical response, the simple and modest bishop e2. Preparing to complete kingside development while supporting the knight on f3, and this bishop may prove quite useful on the d1 to h5 diagonal if white plays a later knight d2. At this point, both sides typically decide to castle. White has established a clear space advantage in the center, so it's important for black to add pressure against it. A straightforward and popular choice is rook e8. Adding pressure against the e4 pawn. An instructive knight maneuver for white in many lines of the modern Benoni is knight d2, supporting the e4 pawn while also eyeing the desirable c4 square. Black is now faced with an important decision: how to develop the queenside knight. One option to consider is the interesting knight a6. Black invites white to play bishop takes a6, surrendering the bishop pair after b takes a6. This exchange opens up the b-file, offering black active play. The knight is ready to move to c7, adding pressure against the d5 pawn, while also preparing to support the important pawn advance b5. A sensible response for white is to reinforce the center with f3. At the expense of weakening kingside dark squares, white supports the e4 pawn, enabling white's knight to advance to the desirable c4 square. After knight c7, if white decides to play knight c4 immediately, this will be well met with b5, gaining a tempo against the knight and preparing queenside expansion. With this in mind, white first plays a4, a common way to discourage black's desirable b5 ambitions. Let's see what happens if black tries to force through b5 without paying attention to white's ideas, starting with a6. Preparing b5 with this move is a common idea, but in this case it is not a desirable choice. White is now ready to play knight c4, adding pressure against the d6 pawn, as well as eyeing the weakened b6 square. Black continues to prepare b5 with rook b8. Now that the rook has vacated the a-file, black is ready to strike with b5. But before black can play this desirable pawn break, white strikes first with bishop f4. Piling up the pressure against the backward d6 pawn, a key strategic weakness to target for white in the modern Benoni. In order to protect this pawn, black can play the undesirable bishop f8, allowing white to clamp down on the weakened dark squares with the well-timed a5, preventing b5, as white can simply capture this pawn with en passant. This is the exact type of passive position black wants to avoid. White enjoys a great space advantage, pouncing on black's weakened dark squares, while black lacks any serious counterplay to compensate for these weaknesses. Instead of playing a6, the creative grandmaster Vladimir Akopian decided to first play b6, discouraging a5 and preparing to meet the natural knight c4 with bishop a6, preparing the possible exchange bishop takes c4. His lower-rated opponent played the sensible bishop g5, pinning the knight to the enemy queen, provoking h6. Centralizing the bishop to e3 appears to be a sensible option, preparing to add pressure against black's kingside dark squares with queen d2, creating a strong queen-bishop battery. But in the game, white decided to maintain the tension against the f6 knight with bishop h4, once again provoking black to chase the bishop with g5, gaining more space on the kingside at the expense of softening some kingside light squares. White retreated the bishop and protected the king with bishop f2. When black continued with the instructive exchange, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4. White now has the bishop pair, but by removing the knight on c4, there's less pressure against the d6 and b6 squares, enabling black to play a6. Without a knight on c4, it's more challenging to prevent black's plan of queenside expansion. Grandmaster Akopian soon played rook b8, achieving the favorable b5 pawn break, creating complications that allowed him to outplay his lower-rated opponent. Instead of playing knight a6, black can also decide to centralize the knight with the straightforward knight b to d7. White's most popular response is to play a4, securing the b5 square, so knight c4 is once again a desirable choice. In Benoni style, black can play the active and provocative move knight e5, centralizing the knight and discouraging knight c4 for the time being. One of black's ideas is to play g5, clamping down on the dark squares while preparing a possible knight g6, eyeing the f4 and h4 squares. A tempting but ultimately misguided decision for white is to play f4. Trying to punish black's last move with the space-gaining advance can backfire after knight e to g4, taking advantage of white's weakened dark squares, threatening a fork on e3. If white decides to capture the knight with bishop takes g4, black's pieces come to life after knight takes g4. Black's dark-squared bishop is ready to leap into the action with bishop d4 check. So after knight f3, defending the d4 square while revealing the dark-squared bishop's protection of e3, black can undermine white's center with the instructive pawn break f5. White's center is under serious pressure when black's bishop pair and overall active piece play will prove difficult to handle. Instead of playing bishop takes g4, another tempting idea is to play knight c4. It appears that black cannot capture the e4 pawn, as this would drop the knight on g4. But black's tactical resources shine after knight takes e4. If white plays knight takes e4, forcing rook takes e4, white's light-squared bishop cannot both capture the knight on g4 while protecting the knight on c4. Instead, if white decides to play bishop takes g4, white is up a piece for a moment, but black can overwhelm white's weakened kingside with bishop d4 check. If white decides to block the check with a move such as bishop e3, black can simply play knight takes c3, attacking white's queen while revealing the rook's pressure against the bishop on e3, so black will regain the piece with a powerful position. This is probably white's best choice, because if white plays king h1, black has the crushing resource bishop takes g4. If white doesn't capture the bishop, then knight f2 is a devastating check. And if white does decide to play queen takes g4, then white's position collapses anyway after knight f2 check, forking the king and queen. You know it's a bad sign when white's best move is to give up the queen with king g1, allowing the discovered check knight takes g4, because rook takes f2 allows a quick checkmate after rook e1. The Benoni is a strategically risky opening for black, but as we saw after a premature f4, black's active piece play should not be underestimated. Instead of playing the premature f4, one solid response is to support the center with queen c2. And another interesting option is to consider the crafty rook e1. This idea has been played by Grandmaster Anton Korobov, preparing to support the center after a better timed f4 advance. To see this idea in action, let's have black play a random, not particularly good move, such as king h8. After this tempo-wasting move, white would then be able to strike in the center with f4, preparing to meet the now familiar knight e to g4, with bishop f3, supporting white's center while revealing the rook's influence on the e-file. In such sharp positions, it's essential for black to play actively, so his opponent decided to play g5, discouraging f4 while opening up the g6 square for black's knight. White emphasized another useful point behind rook e1, taking advantage of the open f1 square with knight f1, revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the unprotected g5 pawn. So after h6, Grandmaster Korobov improved the position of the knight with knight g3, eyeing the weakened f5 and h5 light squares, while also supporting the e4 pawn. White enjoys a stable position. Black is now under pressure to generate sufficient counterplay to compensate for the weakened pawn structure on the king side, as well as the typical backward d6 pawn. Black is by no means helpless, and can consider mixing things up on the king side with the maneuver knight g6 to f4, trying to provoke complications at a favorable moment. Instead of playing knight f3, white has two important ideas involving the f-pawn. One idea is to reinforce the center with f3. This can transpose into the Zamish variation of the king's Indian defense after bishop g7. Strengthening the center with f3 is a sensible choice, but it does weaken some kingside dark squares, and it also interferes with the natural development of the kingside knight. White has a variety of choices, including the popular knight g to e2, preparing knight g3, and bishop e2. Another option for this knight is to wait for black to play knight b to d7, blocking the light-squared bishop, so white can play knight h3 without worrying about bishop takes h3. White can also play bishop e3, centralizing the bishop and supporting some of the weakened kingside dark squares that f3 created. Another active path for this piece is bishop g5, pinning the f6 knight to the queen. A typical continuation after castling is to create a queen-bishop battery with queen d2. If black decides to play a6, preparing the typical b5, as in many cases in the Benoni, white should meet a6 with a4, taking space and discouraging b5 at the expense of weakening the b4 and b3 squares. It's important for white to stay alert after the tactical resource h6. White's most solid choice is to play bishop e3, maintaining the tension against black's kingside, because if white accepts the pawn with bishop takes h6, black can take advantage of white's weakened kingside dark squares with the surprising shot knight takes e4, attacking the enemy queen while revealing the d8 to h4 diagonal for black's queen. This becomes relevant after knight takes e4, allowing the double attack queen h4 check, forking the king and dark-squared bishop. White can win a pawn after the sequence g3, queen takes h6. Black regains the piece, allowing white to exchange queens with queen takes h6, bishop takes h6. The typically weak d6 pawn falls after knight takes d6. Not only does black's bishop on h6 have uncontested control over the dark squares, black has the strong resource knight d7. Black's idea is to play rook d8, followed by knight b6, or, if necessary, knight f6, when black will target the weakened isolated d5 pawn, likely regaining the sacrificed pawn with a reasonable position. A critical test of the modern Benoni is to grab more space in the center with f4. White has declared total war against black's position, preparing e5, and in some cases after white castles, placing a rook on the f-file. f5 is another pawn break to keep in mind. After black's typical response bishop g7, one direct attempt to challenge black's setup is with the double-edged e5, turning the game into the Mecanis attack. If black decides to resolve the tension with d takes e5, white marches forward with f takes e5. White's central pawns can become quite dangerous, preparing to meet knight f to d7 with e6. Black has to be very well prepared to properly manage this early pressure. Instead of resolving the central tension, black can retreat the knight with knight f to d7, applying serious pressure against white's center. If white decides to capture the d6 pawn, this opens up the powerful dark-squared bishop, and black can simply decide to castle, when white's undeveloped position with the king in the center will have serious problems justifying this path. If white decides to resolve the central tension with e6, black can respond with f takes e6, d takes e6, and knight b6, revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure against the e6 pawn. By refusing to relieve the tension in the center, black's d6 pawn may advance to d5, which would take over the center with a strong position. In this case, white's early attacking ambitions at the expense of neglecting development does not look very impressive. Rather than resolving the tension in the center, white can provoke additional complications with knight b5, attacking the d6 pawn and preparing to meet d takes e5 with the disruptive knight d6 check. Black's king is somewhat exposed after king e7. When white continues with knight takes c8 check, queen takes c8. Black's position may not look very attractive, but modern Benoni players do not defend black's position because of how it may look. The question is whether or not the positions are playable and create sufficient counter chances. In this messy position, black's king is not ideally placed, but there isn't an obvious way for white to exploit its position. Black is up a pawn, with a lead in development for the time being, and this position appears fully playable for black, especially if one has carefully prepared these lines beforehand to help navigate the chaos. Instead of lunging forward immediately with e5, a more dangerous option for white is to play the disruptive bishop b5 check, turning the game into the Taimanov attack. By first inserting this check, e5 becomes a more powerful threat. If black decides to respond with bishop d7, or the natural-looking knight b to d7, These responses are well met by e5. Attacking the f6 knight, and if black doesn't capture e5, then e6 is threatening to win a piece, so black should play d takes e5. F takes e5. The position becomes incredibly sharp after knight h5. Moving the knight away from the e5 pawn when white marches forward with e6. Attacking the pin knight on d7 when black unleashes a counterattack with queen h4 check. We reach a boiling point in the position after g3. Inviting knight takes g3, h takes g3, and queen takes h1. There is no rush to immediately capture the pin knight on d7, so one move to explore is bishop e3. Developing another piece while supporting the unprotected, as well as pin knight on g1. White is temporarily sacrificed in exchange, but is prepared to soon collect the pin knight on d7. Objectively speaking, white should be on the more favorable end of these complications, but this razor-sharp position leaves little room for error, allowing greater practical chances for the better prepared player. The Taimanov attack was once thought of as the virtual refutation of the modern Benoni, but loyal defenders of this risky defense sought refuge with knight f to d7. Retreating an already developed piece can feel strange, but this has become the mainline response against the Taimanov. The knight will not be immediately harassed by e5, and retreating this knight also reveals the scope of the powerful dark-squared Benoni bishop on g7. Black would like to gain a tempo against the bishop with a6, preparing to then grab more space with b5. So white can anticipate this idea with a4, grabbing space and reinforcing the b5 square. One interesting idea to independently explore is softening white's kingside structure with queen h4 check, provoking g3, and then returning the queen to e7. A more straightforward continuation is simply castling the king out of the center. When white sensibly reinforces the center and prepares to castle with knight f3. If black decides to play a6, then white will support the center with bishop d3. This decision will cause some problems for black's knight on b8, as it does not have an obvious way to enter the game. The interested viewer is encouraged to explore the idea knight a6, when black may plant a knight on b4, one drawback to the desirable a4 move. Once the knight is planted on b4, black may prepare to move the b-pawn and play bishop a6, challenging white's light-squared bishop. It's worth noting that if black plays rook e8, challenging white's center, a strong response is to simply castle. White continues to build a comfortable position while black remains cramped for space and still struggles to complete development. If black decides to grab a pawn with bishop takes c3, b takes c3. Giving up black's best minor piece, the dark-squared Benoni bishop, is a very risky strategy, and after rook takes e4, white has the strong response knight g5. Gaining a tempo against the rook and intending to attack black's weakened kingside with f5. The absence of black's dark-squared bishop is definitely felt as white begins to attack on the kingside, so giving up this important piece and allowing white a dangerous initiative is not worth the pawn. The Taimanov attack can be a serious challenge to the modern Benoni, although a well-prepared player can find reasonable ways to stay afloat as black. Sometimes Benoni players are turned off by this option, so they try a tricky move order with e6. This is a move order to reach the Benoni that former world champion Mikhail Tal played on occasion as black. The idea is that if white plays knight c3, black may decide to play the Nimzo Indian with bishop b4, an incredibly reliable and positionally sound opening for black. It also might just be a bluff, preparing to respond to knight c3 with c5 in any case, transposing back into the modern Benoni after d5. There's a bit of psychology at play here, as a fair amount of d4 players prefer to avoid the Nimzo Indian, and instead of playing knight c3, they may play g3 or knight f3. Now that the knight blocks the f-pawn, white will not be able to play a quick e4 and f4, entering the Taimanov attack. This means that after c5, inviting a transposition into the modern Benoni after d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, and d6, black has entered the modern Benoni while restricting white's options. That being said, after the natural moves knight c3, g6, white can transpose into the lines we examined with e4, but delaying this move also offers additional options for white. White may decide to fianchetto on the kingside with g3, or possibly play bishop f4, adding immediate pressure against the d6 pawn, with the possible idea of knight d2 to c4, intensifying the pressure against d6. By not immediately committing to e4, black is deprived of a natural target on the e-file for the time being. Of course, black is not without resources, and these positions are still debated at grandmaster level. Against e4, the modern Benoni is a razor-sharp defense in which black doesn't mind living on the edge. A single misstep can prove fatal, but this can also be true for white. Benoni players do not mind accepting serious risk in exchange for sharp positions, with the potential for tremendous piece play and counter-attacking chances. White enjoys a comfortable space advantage with active, straightforward development, but taming the modern Benoni in practice, especially against a well-prepared opponent, is far from a trivial task. Thanks for exploring the modern Benoni, and now you have no shortage of ideas to explore when facing this sharp opening. Or perhaps you'll embrace the dangers
double step. I think should be better. His eyes. I need to. No, triple check. What's it doing here? This phone is weak. You can. Just go ahead. Ignore more than the अपने उम्र में नौजवान you take you go ahead check इसका हाल होना check the note please wow nice tactics no for this one three hero I could take the mother tongue okay it's not good idea it push this pawn ये तो मार सकता है ना ये पाँच तक तो just go back also go here but it's fine from here ये नाइट का कोनो काम है थे ना खबर तो खबर पकोड़ा हो go here, है ना? One, two, one, two. Let's go back. Let's let the potato save it. इससे थोड़ा लगता है. अपन लवर को धोखा दे, मुझे भी डार्लिंग मौका दो. चेक कला go go here. It's unnecessary. Takes. अब हम मन पे साला को बेसी बोल देता. Dummy. Takes. Let's check. We try to get. We will try go here maybe. Go here. पर्छ अपने लभरको Let's go here. Oh, चालू है बच्चा चालू है पछाडि बच्चे का उदाहरण जसको यार पुश करे तरी अपने लवर को धोखा दो मुझे भी डार्लिंग मौका मुझे भी डार्लिंग मौका दो इसको यार कुछ स्पून लगे अपने लहर का नोचे इसको यार I think side view should be winning this game. To baby go back पसंद है push 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 in the corner easy peasy चल तो लेंगे इसको यार अपने लहर को मौका दो मुझे भी डार्लिंग मौका दो इसको यार make sense से ball okay इसको यार you can find